this up to an open discussion at the end as much as possible. So that way we can take advantage of kind of the impressive range of expertise and experience that all of you are bringing into this conversation. So having a mix of teachers who have been in search of support and coordinators who are looking to offer that support, hopefully that there'll be a kind of free and open exchange when we get to that part of today's webinar. And so I also wanted to point out, so I've been really impressed. I haven't been able to attend, but I've been watching from I'd like to pick up on a few issues from Zoe Matthews' webinar a few weeks back on integrating social and cultural contexts into language acquisition. So the kind of skills and context that she focused on. And then also Hadi El-Shafi's workshop on empowered conversation as a space of mutual exchange and inspiration from, was that just last week or maybe 2 weeks ago? And so how is it that that kind of approach to conversational skills is, I think, especially pertinent to what we're going to be discussing here today. Okay, so that, let me share my screen. Okay. So I want to start today's session by kind of offering, like I said, 2 anecdotes drawn from my own experience of having inherited classrooms from untrained teachers. So the first, I'll call him Joe. He's an English language tutor, a trained tutor, but not TOEFL certified. He was someone who we might consider kind of overconfident in his ability, which is, you know, I think in certain cases a skill or something beneficial that we should try to see how we can take best advantage of. But that what this led to is him being kind of anxious in moving through material really quickly at an elementary or ADC level class. So apologies for the stereotypes. I'm just trying to set up these 2 kind of limit cases so we can figure out how is it that we negotiate between these positions. And then on the other hand, I inherited another class. This is an intermediate level class from a fellow teacher who I'll call Jane. And Jane was a university student. And whereas the Joe character is more kind of overconfident, my experience taking this class over from Jane is that she oftentimes found herself feeling overwhelmed by the kind of responsibility of leading this class. And because of that sense of being overwhelmed, kind of reluctant to proceed. So on the one hand, we have somebody who's quite confident and moving through material too quickly. And on the other hand, we have someone who's kind of reticent and unwilling to push the class, I think, in the ways that are necessary to kind of keep the momentum of the language acquisition going. So these kind of prototypes, you know, there are problems in both of the limit cases, but also kind of the opportunities maybe for a kind of sense of collaboration between them, and especially with the support then of professionals such as yourselves, who are able to come in and kind of recognize the limitations in both of these cases, and then help them kind of negotiate through what needs to happen. And so I offer these up as just kind of models to keep in mind, and then I want to turn kind of quickly to, sorry here. So turning to my kind of own experience in the classroom, which I think is somewhat situated between the two and maybe in certain ways influenced by having inherited classes from both of these individuals. A few examples of my own experience teaching on Samos, so that we have kind of some shared materials for discussion. I don't mean for these to be kind of groundbreaking or extraordinary lessons in any way, but rather some practical examples for reference in our conversation, and maybe a glimpse into the lessons offered by an untrained, well-intentioned teacher. So first, I introduced this kind of lesson that I taught, as you can see, on Friday, July 20th, 2018, a lifetime ago. The notion of kind of who, what, when, where, why, and how. Basic concepts. Again, this is the class that I inherited from the first individual, Joe. But the notion that the benefit of these kind of questions is an opportunity to really focus on repetition and also conversation as the driving kind of lesson here. So we can see here, and I should say kind of conversation in terms of the telephone model is something that I found kind of useful and that I was able to acquire from actual TOEFL trained teachers. So being able to kind of both form a question and then answer a question, and use this as an opportunity to get the students to interact amongst themselves, while also allowing me to kind of transcribe what was going on in the conversation as a means of, again, repeating the key terms, repeating the material, but also enabling the students to perform the conversation with one another as much as possible, right? We all know that this is probably a more idealized transcript of the actual conversation, but nevertheless one that reflects the abilities of the students in the room as much as it can. Building upon this, moving into kind of the need, want, have model, where taking those kind of repetitive questions from before that were really kind of basic, focusing on the question of what, and then introducing kind of new materials or new concepts so that they can kind of actually build out more informed or engaged notions of conducting conversations around a single question. Again, using the telephone type model here, for example, Ahmed wanted to play football. He needed a football. Arash had a football, or has a football. Arash did not give him the football. The way to actually engage the students in conversing around a kind of set question. And again, I offer this up not as an exemplary model, but as one I'm sure for those of you that are TOEFL trained, it should be, I'm sure it's setting off all sorts of red flags, but ways that we can talk about how the mistakes being made too, as well as some of the benefits. And speaking of mistakes, this lesson, in terms of giving directions, introducing the kind of concept or applying, the question of where to these kind of life skills. This is the one lesson that I actually had a student more than one student stand up and walk out of because of the kind of frustrations over the kind of social ramification or the practical ramification of this lesson. So actually taking the model of another question, applying it to life skills, trying to engage the students in kind of practical issues that are directly relevant to their daily routines, and translating that into English so that they're both kind of understanding conceptually what's going on, but then also linguistically how to describe this activity. Building into a kind of more advanced class, combining some of these materials, moving on from questions and actually beginning to develop narratives and express kind of relationships around one's own experience. Like I said, here we have, my name is Hans, I live in Berlin, I speak German. So trying to build out upon those examples from before, but again, with a more sophisticated set of language learners. And then finally, with apologies from the typo, misspelling air conditioning on this screen, this lesson conducted with a more advanced English class, obviously, in terms of actually thinking in the conditional sense and the ways in which abstractions introduce. And I also wanted to emphasize here the fact that one of the lessons, so on the one hand, it's a quite advanced conceptual lesson in terms of the conditional sense, but it's also a very basic lesson in terms of capitalization, punctuation, sentence structure. So this is something that honestly I continue to see as an issue with my native English speaking college students here in the United States, that capitalization and punctuation is a kind of recurring matter. But remembering that too, that even with our most intelligent students, some of these basics that are assumed based upon someone who speaks pretty proficiently or eloquently, that when it actually comes to writing the language, that these kind of issues, punctuation and capitalization, tend to recur. And it's something that we're all kind of guilty of increasingly as we rely upon texting to kind of autocorrect all of our kind of basic grammatical issues. That here, just as a reminder, more so to the teacher and to the student, to really pay attention to these matters. And so across all of these models, what I try and impart is what I would consider a kind of improvisational approach based around a core agenda. And that the one thing that always came through in my experience is that, as a kind of counterbalance to the anxiety of the one teacher that was moving really quickly through material, and also the reluctance of the other teacher who was perhaps hesitant to move on, is that there's something about really stressing patience, I think, as a core agenda for these teachers. That patience is neither too fast nor inert, right? But that it is a matter of kind of emphasizing, going back over, taking the time that's necessary, almost to the point of, I think, boring a native speaker, but that really kind of encouraging that amongst teachers, and especially those of us that are untrained, is something that is essential from the start. And so I wanted to take just a minute here to talk about the kind of supportive educational relationship that came up in the introduction. And that I think that typically what we think of when we think about a kind of academic or educational environment is one of mentorship, right? Because it's a replication of the model of teacher to student. And so if we have kind of two teachers working together, that one will be the mentor to the other. So it's a hierarchical arrangement. It's meant to be instructive. It's quite successful in these ways. But one of the issues I think that we should recognize in dealing with these kind of extra institutional settings, like where we all are, is that the model of mentorship is also a model of obligation of the one teacher to the untrained teacher. And so it adds an additional kind of layer of preparation, of instruction, that is a kind of maybe unnecessary burden given these new settings. And so instead of that, I'd propose something more like a partnership as an ongoing and more sustainable approach to thinking of how untrained teachers and trained teachers might be set up to work together in each of our institutions. Because unlike the hierarchical arrangement of the mentorship, the partnership is mutual, and rather than being instructive, it's collaborative. And so the idea here being that whereas the trained teacher has so much kind of information and experience to offer and to share, that there's also something to be offered and shared from the kind of excitement and maybe kind of new perspective offered by the untrained individual who has decided to volunteer their time outside of their realm of expertise, but that nevertheless has a kind of excitement or inspirational kind of approach to this that can, hopefully be used also to encourage the work of the experienced teacher alongside of them. And so here, setting up the model of exchange without the obligation to tutor, or without the kind of imposition of seniority, which, it's a tricky negotiation, right? We want to encourage the participation of the amateur teacher, and we want to recognize the expertise of the trained teacher, but without kind of infringing upon the actual abilities and capabilities of either one. And so in this way, kind of points of shared contact in maybe a kind of recurring meeting between teaching partners, not that they would share the classroom, but that they would share the kind of experience of teaching on a daily or perhaps weekly basis, which turns the lack of the kind of rigorous institutional structure into a shared benefit that they might be able to kind of discuss and work around and offer their own take upon. Because in this way, I think one of the keys to my experience is to emphasize the kind of emotional toll of teaching, which is familiar to many of us, but quite new and quite jarring, I would say, to the inexperienced teacher, who's used maybe to more obvious systems of affirmation in whatever kind of professional or academic background that they have, right? In terms of being graded, being promoted. Once you end up in a classroom, you have a very different kind of relationship to progress, to success. And so how is it that we might be able to kind of imagine those kind of initial moments of anxiety, but also encouragement that kind of motivate each one of us. And so to try to harness the enthusiasm of someone going through an experience for the first time as a reminder of that kind of initial spark that led each one of us into the field in the first place. And so in that way, I want to kind of emphasize the kind of benefits of having these ambitious volunteers. And especially, I think, as we are not only inviting or making use of untrained international volunteers, but also volunteer teachers from the communities that we're serving themselves, and to really kind of embrace the distinct experience and encourage their unorthodox, potentially innovative approaches that they can offer alongside the expertise of fellow professional educators, right? In the way that some of the lessons are, probably run completely opposite to the kind of TOEFL standardized training. How is it that we can recognize some of those mistakes and correct them, but also understand that in these highly unusual circumstances, that highly unusual approaches might actually be to the benefit of the students themselves. And so in this way, trying to, especially when it comes to working with community-based volunteers, that it hopefully reminds us of the power dynamics at stake in these situations, right? That the teacher to student relationship is compromised, or raises pressures in these particular settings, and that by incorporating community-based volunteers as teachers, it not only makes us appreciative of the student's perspective, but it allows us to kind of understand the student perspective all that much more, especially when it comes to utilizing this type of partnership model in which there's an equal exchange of ideas as much as possible. And so in this way, what I would like to kind of maybe talk about is how is it that we might be able to extend the same inclusive environment that we really stress in terms of providing to the students, to the teachers themselves, right? That there is this kind of similar appreciation of the roles being played in the classroom by amateurs that also need to be taken into account. And by acknowledging the struggles that everyone in these new and high stress environments encounters, and overcomes, hopefully, together. So again, that there's this kind of mutual understanding, mutual approach, more of a collaborative appreciation for what's going on, both inside the classroom and in the educational meetings happening at the end of the school day or before the school day, depending on how you run your organizations. And so with that, you know, I really want to, like I said, take as much time as possible to have an open discussion here to make sure that we're spending the time focused on the particular issues that you've already kind of introduced in the beginning and that you're facing now or anticipate facing in the future, given the fact that we have, like I said, such an incredible collaboration or incredible community of experts coming from very different perspectives on this material. And so I guess what I think would be maybe helpful is to, I have a couple of questions that are maybe more suited towards the coordinators, and then one question that I've focused to the teachers amongst us as a way to kind of open up the floor and to give as many perspectives as possible so we can come back to some of those issues that each one of you have experience with yourselves. And so for the coordinators, I'd like you to consider sort of what are some of the challenges that you've faced when relying upon untrained teachers? And also what are some of the successes that have come from incorporating these amateurs into the curriculum? And how is it that you understand your level of intervention there? I think that's a key. You know, how involved do you want to be, or do you find yourself needing to be? And then for the teachers that don't have coordination experience, maybe a kind of fundamental question is, and it comes back to one of the points I raised before, which is, what do you wish you knew before working in the classroom the first time? As a way of, again, trying to get back to that first day on the job kind of mentality, as a way to think about how is it that you can provide kind of the most fundamental and essential support to your fellow teachers that are now just going through the experience for the first time. And so with that, like I said, I'd like to, I'll stop sharing my screen for now if there's anything that we need to go back to, but I would really like to give the floor back to this, to the group, and hopefully get some more perspective involved.
Thanks, Tim. Yeah, I think it's good to, if everyone can like think about those questions. And also I would say that, like, as Tim said, there's loads of people with all kinds of experience here. So feel free to like answer each other's questions as well, because I think it'll be really interesting just to hear the perspectives from some people who don't have training, some people who have lots of training, some people who have been doing this for many years, and some people who haven't done it a lot. So yeah, just yeah, we can go from there with the questions that Tim asked at the beginning.
Tim, could you rephrase the question if you don't mind? Could you rephrase the question if you don't mind?
Yeah, so for especially for people like you, Francois, that are coordinators, if you've faced particular challenges when relying upon untrained teachers, or if you can refer to a particular success that you've had by integrating teachers without kind of formal experience into the academic curriculum, to kind of focus on what are some of the negatives and what are some of the positives, just as a way to kind of see what the differences amongst our experiences are and how, you know, we might share you know, some best practices amongst the group to take advantage of those experiences.
Well, thanks for the clarification. From my side, I'll give an example. When I have met untrained teachers, although I have recruited him, you know, after recruitment, it doesn't mean that you will fire the person. You need to support the person. Is that correct? If I'm correct. So we are there to support the people. So what I've done, I realized that some of the untrained teachers, for example, when it comes to giving an assessment, being summative or formative, they use the same keyword, they use the same assessment objective in the test or in the examination. I'll give an example. We find that a test or an examination only having questions like explain throughout the question paper. So for me, they were not really testing anything to the students. So I had to explain to them that no, there are so many assessment objectives. This can include like define, explain, corroborate, elaborate, comment, or give your personal view. In this way, you'll be testing so many areas of that child. Keeping in mind that we have, many different types of students. Some of them are good in memorizing, some others are good in expressing themselves. So if you only ask the same assessment criteria throughout the question, you will be disadvantaging this other group of students. So I used to give training to these untrained teachers onto this assessment objective for the betterment of the students. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Francois.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, others that are, maybe to go to the other question too, for those of you that have kind of teaching experience, and I realize it's a kind of impossible or highly imaginative task, and go back to your first day in the classroom, you know, sort of what do you wish that you knew coming in, might also be a way to kind of open the discussion up a little bit more, where we can recognize from our own experience points that we wish we had been better supported when encountering, and then others maybe, or points of appreciation where you realize that you were struggling and somebody actually kind of was able to make a difference at that early stage.
Okay, I'll add something maybe from the point of view of looking back to when I first started teaching. And I suppose one thing that I would really wish there had been more of was that kind of mutual support, but in a very non-hierarchical, collective way. Because at all times, sometimes classes just don't go the way that you anticipated they might for a whole bunch of reasons. And the worst feeling is leaving a class and not really knowing why it was a car crash. And then if you don't speak to someone about that, even just to tell them how you're feeling on an empathetic level, but also maybe to try and reflect and get into the cycle of reflective practice. But that means that you didn't really learn anything from it. But more importantly, I think for our context, is that you take that feeling home with you. And I think that that's something that I've noticed in it with a lot of volunteer teachers in general, but especially here, that it is a very stressful, challenging context. And if you're taking those feelings home with you, without anywhere to share with them and reflect on them, then it really increases your chances of burning out and also not having a great experience.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, Tiff, and I really like that point too, because it reminds me that some of those classes that you walk out of and you feel like are just an absolute unmitigated disaster, a week later, a student will make a comment that refers to that class, and you realize that they actually did pick up a kind of essential lesson that in the midst of everything, you just totally, like, you as the teacher just feel so defeated, and you realize that there are still kind of minor successes amidst the, you know, the dumpster fire that they seem to be, right? You know, so I think having that that conversation on a daily basis, or that kind of level of social interaction amongst teachers, is really important, so that you can recognize that yeah, you're not alone in having those awful days, and then also that the awful day isn't necessarily as kind of awful or as defeated as it seems from the front of the, or from the lectern, right?
I think also on that, like when we're talking, that relates to kind of the idea of partnership and everything. If you can speak to more people who've got different experience, and as in like culturally different experiences of learning as well, I think that comes into it, because what we might perceive as quite a repetitive or you know, maybe not a very interactive class, like that might seem like a not the best class. Like you might think you haven't done a very good job, but actually if that's what people are more used to, then maybe they got a lot out of it. And only by like sharing those different cultures of teaching and ways of teaching are you gonna like feel like there are other ways to do it than what we know from the UK or wherever you're from. So yeah, I would say that as well.
Yeah, yeah. Thanks, Tim, for this question. But I wanted this maybe to be more interactive. It is not only asked to teachers, but all of us have been in the classroom situation.
Absolutely.
Could they tell us a situation whereby they realize that this teacher is untrained? And what they do, what was the reaction? Thank you very much.
It's a good question. I mean, it seems like most of us are kind of untrained, so we know that we're untrained because we know ourselves. But yeah, I mean, you're going to see this, and I'm sure that it's one of those, the trained eye, the person with the TOEFL certification, like I said, and this is part of the reason that I wanted to share the slides of my own lessons. I don't imagine that I would have fooled any of you that have that training with sort of the lessons that I was offering. Mm-hmm. And so, and yet it's sort of what are some of the beneficial outcomes, despite the fact that we're not going about things according to the orthodox training. And how is it that the trained teacher, this is kind of what I'm interested in parsing, is how is it that the trained teacher can offer some guidance for those of us that don't have that training without it becoming an obligation for them actually kind of teaching another class, which is a kind of stand-in TOEFL, because that to me doesn't seem like the best use of anyone's time in these situations, but more to take advantage of the skills that are being kind of volunteered across these organizations as much as possible. So I think that's how is it that we can reduce the burden upon the trained teachers so that they don't feel like they're being overworked because of their expertise, and instead create a more kind of exchange type relationship between trained and untrained teachers, given the circumstances that we're all working in, which are stressful enough without that kind of additional obligation.
I think as well, with working within these kinds of organizations, it's not just a case of who's trained and who's not, who's a coordinator and who's a teacher, but also a case of who's worked in this context, like maybe this specific context as well. So I know we were talking about, like, it's good to have someone with lots of different experience, but also sometimes there's someone, like in our team, there's one volunteer who's been with the organization for over a year, and the lessons that she's learned through teaching and the things that she's seen and the challenges she's had to overcome are huge and really useful for absolutely all of us, as well as learning how to kind of develop as an untrained teacher to someone who's now very confident, equally to harness the previous experiences of everyone on your team, and work together with teacher training as well. So possibly having sessions where you exchange ideas or choose a topic and try and divide up the topics and kind of have more interactive sessions between teams of teachers, so that everyone has a chance to share but also take ownership, maybe of certain styles and things like that. Other ideas as well could be, I mean, this is just from my teacher training when I was in London, but like maybe integrating lesson observations in such a way that it's not putting pressure. It's not like I, as the coordinator, but like maybe to kind of get people to partner up, which is something that's really uncomfortable to begin with. but also just to stress that it is really helpful.
Yeah, and Jody, I think you make a really good point there, which is that training takes many different forms in these contexts, and that familiarity with the organization or with the particular community that's being served is in many ways as essential as the kind of by the book training that we might receive through, English language acquisition systems at home or overseas. So that there is something for someone who's untrained but highly experienced working in that particular organization, that they too, and this is, with the partnership and the exchange, that they can bring that to someone who might have the top credentials, but no actual kind of practical experience in the classroom or practical experience of working in Athens with this group or vice versa. So that this way it takes it spreads the responsibility around maybe a little bit more. So that way there's kind of an equal buy-in between people that have these different cultural experiences and perspectives. And so that there is less of a kind of top-down approach, because inevitably, and especially with groups as dynamic as ours are, in terms of the turnover between teachers, that this way there's a kind of continuity, and I like the term, like interaction between individuals as opposed to just instruction being kind of passed down. Yeah. Anyone else, going back to the kind of the something that you wish you knew, maybe not even before the first time you came into the classroom, but maybe even just before working in the organization that you're currently engaged with, just as a way to kind of bring other experiences into the conversation?
The thing that I would have liked ahead of actually engaging in the language learning would have been some sort of program, because I felt I was, as you say, following on from a succession of short-term teachers who had been using their own materials in the class. And I, as an untrained teacher, wasn't very sure then, where to go with what I was doing. And I have to say, one of my worst experiences was in one of the sort of higher level classes that I was feeling less confident in. And I'd been observing the teacher from the Monday to the Thursday, and then on the Friday she left and I was taking over her class. And she'd been focusing on sort of almost like a geography class. So places of interest around the world, countries, this sort of thing. And I stood up pretty much mirroring what she'd been doing all week. And I got 10 minutes into it, and somebody in the class just said, "We don't want to learn this. This isn't what we want to learn." And I felt absolutely terrible. And as Tiff said, I needed to come out of that class at the end of it and have somebody to go to offload, somebody who would tell me it was okay, somebody who would guide me towards, well, where do you go on Monday then with what they've said to you, and to give me some sort of guidance about other materials that rightly, they were absolutely right. It was completely the wrong stuff that was being taught, and to find more appropriate materials for that particular setting. That would have been fine in some sort of other educational establishment, but it definitely wasn't the right material to be doing in that particular setting.
Yeah. Yeah, so it's a good lesson in terms of, both the kind of, maybe something for us to keep in mind, that in one hand, having the kind of continuity of curriculum is important, but at the same time, and that we need to be responsive to the particular needs of the populations that we're interacting with in these settings. And I think that's something I'm trying to stress here today too, is that flexibility needs to extend both from teacher to student and between teachers, I think is a really important crux to keep in mind, in that everything is so volatile that maintaining open lines of conversation kind of in as many directions as possible simultaneously is the best way to make sure that the students and the teachers and the teachers and the teachers and the teachers and the coordinators all feel like they're part of a kind of continuing discussion that is reflective of the particular demands or stresses of the moment in a way that's more responsive and inclusive than simply following the kind of the book. So how is it that we can use those lessons most effectively, but also recognize the particular interests or frustrations or whatever it is of the students and the fellow teachers, right? That if this all needs to happen in a very collaborative way, because if you have one teacher that is unwilling to work in this collaborative way, it kind of throws off the dynamics of students that might be graduating between classes or moving up from level to level. So yeah, thanks, Karen.
I think Karen makes a very, very important point, and it brings up something which I recall that when I worked with new teachers or trainee teachers, of looking for gifts. Everything that comes from the learners are gifts. And even though in Karen's mind, and I know this feeling because it's happened to me, when a learner is able, has the guts to stand up and tell you, sorry, we don't want this. To turn it around from being, oh my God, I'm terrible, I failed, but to help the trainee teacher to turn it around and saying, well, bravo, thank you very much. Now, how to make that turnaround is hugely difficult because even working with experienced teachers, they find it sometimes difficult to do that. But something I've learned from very early on is to see everything that comes from the learners as gifts. And in terms of the community of teachers, a team of teachers, for an untrained teacher, this usually means having a partner sitting in on the lesson to help notice things, because when the teacher is focused on what he or she is working on, it's very difficult to actually focus on what the learners themselves are giving you. Mm. But I can understand in this, in a kind of, in the situation that people are in, are there enough human resources to have a partner sitting in with the lesson? This is the issue, this is the problem. But no, thank you, Karen. You brought up a very important point there.
I think, can I
I think I will not go beyond by mentioning that in this situation, we should encourage the untrained teacher to use not only the teacher-centered method, but also to come back to learner teacher-centered method, so that it is interactive in a way that it's not the teacher giving only, but also students are giving. That will create a kind of motivation in this situation. Thank you very much.
Yeah, and that the classroom isn't an isolated, I think, teachers, we tend to think of our little autonomous zones, which are the classes that we teach, and that somehow they're kind of impervious to the outside world. And actually, I think something in this setting is really important to kind of, yeah, Sammy, we don't have the resources to put 2 teachers in every room, but that the idea that there has to be a kind of exchange between teachers in a way that is unusual for most academic settings, because the reliance upon one another is all that more crucial. And to really encourage teachers from the very beginning that maybe your lesson occurs within the classroom, but the education really needs to occur kind of between the classrooms, even with teachers that you don't otherwise have any interaction with, that there is a kind of sense of community, sense of collaboration, interaction constantly. And that's, how that happens is really difficult, and it really depends upon the kind of the culture of each institution, but that it's something that maybe we just keep in mind as being a real priority, regardless of the setting. Sorry, Olivia, you were going to say something. I think I cut you off.
I can't remember what I was going to say, but I can say something else now. I was going to say, in terms of, yeah, what we were just speaking about, I think it is down to like the coordinators and the coordination team. And I'm saying this from like getting it wrong a lot of times, like doing different types of coordination. But I think it's so easy to, especially when people aren't coming for a long time, it's easy to let them like just slip through without any support, and like making sure that you have those structures in place, that it, whether it be like a weekly meeting, or making sure you say, okay, you guys are, you're a pair, like you need to sit down at this time every week, or make sure you give each other an hour a week to either do a lesson observation or just go through things, go through resources. I think there's like so many ways you can do it, but like sometimes the ways I've found work well are like having all the teachers like in the same place doing their lesson planning. I know that's not that can't happen now with COVID and stuff, but that's always quite a nice way, because then people are like sharing ideas and they feel physically like that you can just ask a question if you don't know. And I've been in situations where like that, where it's so much nicer to plan with other teachers around you than like at home alone and think, I don't know what I'm doing, I hope this works. Like just simple things like that, I think as a coordinator, just make sure that they're in their real priorities for like the structure of your week, and then it will, like, tiny things do help.
And I think also to encourage a kind of, as a way of making it community-based, that it's not just another meeting, because at the end of the day, everyone's exhausted. The last thing, I mean, we need to have these kind of meetings, but to encourage, especially, and that's why like partnerships or maybe small cohorts of 2 or 3 teachers that can go out and get a coffee, again, in the future times that that's possible, and you can have a kind of really frank conversation about how classes have gone that day or the last 2 days, but that it's something that if the organization is kind of facilitating those relationships and encouraging those kind of casual relationships as an ongoing practice, it's a way to create an institution without it feeling institutional. Maybe, you know, it's where it's something that people can come to rely upon without it being another meeting with every teacher rehashing their week for 2 hours on a Thursday night when everyone just wants to go home and go to sleep. But this kind of the time spent between classes is really important, not just after classes.
And I think when you use that time really well, and maybe also engage with, like, so we were working with community volunteers, and we were really doing like the preparation of the classes, and we debrief as well with the community volunteers, so you can also really get their input, what is going well, what is not going well. They might pick up on cultural clues a lot more, where we are thinking, great, we got to speak and they were all listening, so that's great. They might pick up on like, maybe this topic is relevant or not, or that was just them being polite, but actually they, so I think it do, to get that feedback from within the community as well. And I think what I wanted to say earlier, your example, Karen, I think it's great that they actually gave that feedback to you, and that they were so honest that they shared with you after 10 minutes, like, this is not what we want to learn, because then you can have that conversation about like, what do you actually want to learn? So I think that was actually great.
And Niska, I like your point too, because what you link those as well, because the community volunteers, but we can't all rely upon having students as bold as Karen's. So that sentiment can be really prevalent, but no one would ever say it because they don't want to risk offense. Whereas the community volunteer can relay that in a way that can be a little maybe less traumatizing than just being told we don't want this, but that letting the teachers know is really important. And so engaging people within the community in that curriculum development level is important too.
Having come into a context where I was coming in and teaching with lots of people who weren't teacher trained, and I had teacher training, but not for what we were doing. And I kind of within a week got a few people turning around and being like, but am I doing this right? Am I doing this right? And they'd been there much longer than I had and were doing an amazing job from everything I could see, but hadn't had the message that I had spent 4 years getting a bachelor's having, which is that your relationship with your students should always be the most important thing, and that students are only going to be learning when you have that reciprocal trust and that relationship. And these people were doing that amazingly, but they were putting so much pressure on themselves because they thought, you know, it's all about, am I delivering everything right? But you know, if they walked out on the street, they have 20 students running up to them to come say hi and have, even if it's like a 2-second conversation, you know, all that learning is happening, and the most important thing is being fulfilled. So I just think really emphasizing to people who come into teaching that the most important thing is always the relationships, and that if they're doing that well, you know, it really doesn't matter if they have 10 lessons in a row that bomb, because if the students sit there and laugh and they keep coming back, they're still learning something, they're still interacting, and most of all, they're in a safe space. And most of us are working in a context where the safe space is actually the primary thing that we are offering. The education is of course important, but it's actually secondary. What we really want to do is make people feel that they're emotionally supported. And when they have that relationship and they love and trust the person they're coming to, that's so much more important than anything else. And, you know, if you, coming from a teacher background, that's part of the training that you get, is to acknowledge that that's so important, that not only do we need to focus on content, but when you're coming in without that background, probably no one's ever told you how important that is. So I just think making a point of saying it really values and underpins what teachers are doing. And I feel like it's a really important thing to take into consideration as a coordinator, but also just as a teacher, as a volunteer, to turn around to fellow people and point out what they're doing really well and support it.
Yeah, I mean, I like that point, Yolanda, because I think the thing that draws people to volunteer in these situations kind of intuitively is that sense of relationship or interaction or community and the emotional interaction that, just reminding these untrained teachers that their kind of natural or their inclination, what's brought them there in the first place, is a successful approach to teaching, even if it's not part of a kind of orthodoxy or training that they would have received elsewhere. And so using that as a kind of encouragement or a point of emphasis, and something to kind of remind that it's, thanks, I like that.
I think another point, I think that was a really, really good point and really well made. Something else that I wish I would learn, and I remember realizing later on that it's good to remind teachers, especially untrained teachers, is that like every lesson is a new chance. And students don't, like, you have it in your head that you remember all the worst bits, but actually when students come to the next lesson, they're not thinking about that mistake that you may or may not have made. One, they've come back. And two, it's a new chance, and just to treat, and you've got that all the time. So to see that as more of an opportunity, and so, you know, you've never like fully ruined everything. So just, you've got a new chance every time, and that students don't hold on, like they don't hold on to everything. Like what you did is such a minute part of everything they're doing in their day and everything they're experiencing. So yeah, that kind of like positive affirmation that you've just got a chance to start over again and again and again and again.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point that Yolanda made, and you know, I think the importance of creating that bond and rapport with your students, for me, is actually the most important thing in any setting, formal or informal. But here there's a shift of priorities when you're working in these contexts, and I think it really should be pretty much up at the top. I think the advantages you get from it are that you create a kind of culture of compassion in the class, and that you realize that, if that bond is there, then just as you've created a safe space for people to make mistakes and learn via their mistakes, that actually goes both ways. And you realize that these lovely people who are in your class, they will be just as forgiving of you. And that's a nice thing to take home out of your class and reflect on later when you're beating yourself up for being the worst teacher in the world. You realize that they've actually already forgiven you and are just looking forward to class. If you create a space that is non-hierarchical, where everyone is actually working together and also learning from each other, it's something that I always prioritize with students, is that is that really they are teachers just the same as me, and we're all there to learn from each other. And I suppose the other thing that I've seen a lot is that sometimes teachers or volunteers who've really struggled as teachers are those who actually have a lot of experience but apply it very rigidly. And if I had to say what I thought were three of the most important qualities for being a volunteer teacher in this context, I would say creativity, reflection, and a certain amount of empathy. And if you can apply those things, creativity, I suppose, an adaptation, but if you can apply those things, that will stand you at least as well as a lot of teaching experience.
Yeah, Tiff, thanks. I think that's a really good point, and it's one. I think that it's also a point that's maybe difficult to remember in the moment in the classroom, because maybe this is some of your experiences too, is that a lot of these students, even as adult learners, they come from cultures in which education is a kind of rigorous or uniform or hierarchical, very by the book. And so trying to introduce a different methodology that is more kind of empathetic and inclusive and responsive is something that I think they appreciate, but they are a little, I always got a little bit of pushback from some students that felt like, no, this needs to be more rigorous. And so creating the kind of shared or safe spaces that acknowledges their kind of expectations of a classroom, and that is both responsive to that and maybe more kind of creative and reflective is a kind of secondary lesson that's also going on as by virtue of them attending classes with our different organizations. And it's a place in which, not being a trained teacher, it might actually be, again, another kind of benefit, because you don't have the kind of orthodoxy of the student and the orthodoxy of the teacher kind of running in coordination. That if you have somebody that's a little more flexible, so to speak, or creative in their approach, that it changes that dynamic right from the beginning to a more interactive one.
This is very interesting, because it seems the idea of a teacher, trained or untrained, seems to be a distraction. What seems to be at the center is us as human beings. And first and foremost, we're meeting these people as a human being who's reached a certain degree of success in his or her life. And we're sharing that success with these people and giving something of it. So the idea of that, creating a kind of safe and secure zone where this sharing can take place. And it's almost as though the language is a byproduct.
Yeah.
Almost. And in a sense, we're all successful language learners. So in a sense, we're creating the conditions to allow the learners to do what they do naturally. So that's what I'm learning from this session, that the emotional engagement is something that that should be celebrated. And if a lesson doesn't work, hey, so what? We're still alive. We're not beating each other up. We go away and then we come back. And that I think is very refreshing, because other sessions I've participated in with teacher training has often focused on the mechanics, the techniques, which can often be like a huge load. But this seems to be going down a different track, which I think is very, as I said, very refreshing and very, very important to get through, I think.
Yeah, thanks, Sammy. I think it was a really beautiful point. I think it comes back to this, it's a conversation, right? And I think that the benefits that we have in these classrooms is keeping the conversation going, and that conversation came up in the previous session too, is as much listening and responding as it is talking. And so regardless of your level of training or of the level of your students, that really, I mean, language is communication, right? So it's what is being expressed, what is being shared, what is being exchanged. And yeah, regardless of the failure of the map frustrating students and they storm out of the room, it doesn't matter. We're thinking, we're sharing those frustrations, we're actually kind of engaged in that. And so in this way, like, again, coming back to the amateur is in a way a perfect teacher in certain sense, because they don't have maybe that same kind of rigorous expectation of what is the outcome, what are the objectives of each day, and instead, how is it that we can think of the kind of objectives of the communication, of the emotional, the community that results from this. And so that's something where, again, this notion of exchange, and that also to remember that and to reflect that also between the community of teacher and student, and then between teachers themselves, that there is this kind of sense of exchange, and that we don't need to be observing one another in order to kind of instruct one another, but to observe one another so that we can find kind of shared points of success, frustration, how those things are being communicated and being kind of shared as much as possible, so that we can get up tomorrow and go back to class regardless of how terrible it was the day before or how great it was the day before. Those are kind of secondary issues.
Yeah, and what you say, none of us are untrained.
Yeah. We're all there, like that, being there is the number one thing, being in the classroom on a day, like you said, the student that comes back the next day as frustrated as they were, that it's really important that they came back. And so, and also for the teacher, it's really important that defeated as you felt yesterday, the next day you came back and, stood in front of the class and just, you keep going, so.
We probably have around like 5 minutes left, because I don't want to keep everyone past the time. I feel like everyone's been saying beautiful things, so please carry on for 5 minutes. Fill these 5 minutes. It's really nice.
I guess there's a quote that I quite often share or translate for students, and but also like to share with when I'm asked to describe my own practice or what things are important to me. And it's a quote from a writer called Eduardo Galeano, a Uruguayan writer. And he said, "Born of the need to speak, nothing can stop the human voice, because every one of us has something to say that's deserving of celebration or forgiveness." And I think, Sammy, you used the word celebrate or celebration, and it made me think about that. And I think that's a good thing to keep in your head, that we will all say things and share things and do things in our safe educational space that are deserving on a different day of celebration or forgiveness.
That was really beautiful, Tiff. I'm not sure what I'm going to say is as beautiful as that.
But I just wanted to share that, yeah, I really agreed with some of the things that Yolanda said. And for me, like supporting teachers while they're here, a big part of it has been just prioritizing putting the space in the schedule for teachers to share together, because it's so easy for the schedule to be taken up with other things, and for there never to be a time in the week when all the teachers can come together. And for us, it's made a massive difference when we were like, Thursdays is a planning day, Thursday morning is for the teachers to offload, share. And sometimes I feel like I have helpful tips or something from my experience. Sometimes I don't, and it's always nice when between the group of teachers, someone else has been in that situation and can offer something. And the other thing that I've found seems to be quite supportive is just kind of really encouraging curiosity and encouraging again the time, and put the resources there. We've definitely had teachers in the past who have no experience whatsoever before and have been like our top teachers. And we had a teacher training session that was done by a very experienced ESOL teacher trainer, and she really commented that she'd previously done a regular CELTA training or something in the UK, and when she compared the people who were attending in Thessaloniki for this training, the empathy levels were just off the scale, and that already gave them so many qualities of making that space in the classroom that's so critical for learning. So I really agree, like encouraging the points that are already there and creating the space for development to happen.
I would 100% agree with that. If I was going to have one criticism of the organisation that I was with, and I 110% appreciated being with them. So it's a criticism, but based on the fact that they were a brilliant organisation. Because they were so giving to the people that they were supporting in the camp, sometimes they didn't make space for the teachers to meet together every week. And as somebody who was trying to offer education when there were very few volunteers there, and most of the volunteers were offering a social activity program, I actually felt quite isolated, because for the social activity programs, volunteers were working together. They were working with resident volunteers. They had a very good social support network outside the camp, because they tended to come into camp later on in the day and then go out for a meal after camp, whereas the language support tended to be earlier in the day. And to be honest, because I'd had to do preparation by the time my sessions finished, all I wanted to do was go home. And to a degree, I felt quite isolated being the only teacher in the class for most of the day. And if that support wasn't available that once a week, I mean, I'm quite an independent person anyway, so it wasn't a major issue, but I would have appreciated, I think, a little bit more support on a regular basis during my time there.
Yeah, I don't think it should be left.
So I would say it is, important that coordinators.
Yeah.
I
don't think it should be left up to like how social, to a person to seek those opportunities out socially at the end of the day. That's not where it should be. It should be the responsibility of the organization to ensure those times are set to make it better, to have the time to like make people flourish. So yeah, I really agree with that.
Yeah, the community between teachers needs to be kind of cultivated as much as the community between, it goes back to, I tried to make this point earlier by saying like teachers like to think of, we have our little fiefdoms, and it's really important, I think, as a support mechanism to encourage collaboration. And, partnership is a way to maybe do it on a personal level, where again, it's not just another meeting, but it has a little bit of a social dynamic. Because I remember my first summer on Samos, I was teaching in a particular shelter away from everyone else. So I had the benefit of it actually being much more like a kind of social event, because we were also providing childcare for some of the students there. Whereas the teachers that were in the main community center, they would come and they would go. We'd see them leave at lunch every day, and no one would see them again until the next day when they also left for lunch. And so I think that really encouraging that kind of integration, between individuals, that way you have a kind of natural way to blow off that steam after a frustrating, or a natural way to kind of celebrate a particularly successful lesson. It's nice to not just grab your coffee and walk home and feel like it's just you. And so I think that that's a way in which maybe untrained teachers, that's something that they can offer, because they're probably less fixated upon the kind of routine of the classroom, and probably a little bit more socially inclined because of their, again, they're going to be university students, so they're just going to be coming from a very different place. And so trying to partner and create a sense of exchange between professionals and non-professionals is hopefully a way to kind of offer that support, so that we're, no one's an island. Everyone gets to interact at least once with somebody who's not just their student each day.
And if I can add to that, I think like one volunteer might be like, oh yeah, I can do this all by myself, got years of experience. I don't need that interaction, whilst others do. So I think it's really good that culture of preparing classes together, or debriefs, or like sharing your information is set by the organization. So it's not just based on like, oh, how well does this team work together? Are they social enough to find each other? Are they like taking that initiative? But making sure that everyone, that's just for everyone the same. Especially I think when you work with short-term volunteers, they might be like, oh, I'm here for a few weeks, I'm gonna use like my maximum amount of time to do as much teaching as possible. But actually it's really about like learning together as well, because I think especially working, sorry, I'm thinking whilst talking, but offer like a certain level of education, and you want to hold up a certain bar. I think it's actually really important to learn together and prepare classes together to establish like a little bit of a continuity and a set level, I think. Yeah.
All right, well, Olivia, I think we're past time, so I don't want to keep everyone here. I mean, I want to thank everyone and encourage, I also don't want to stop the conversation, but maybe before people have to run away, I want to take the opportunity again just to thank each and every one of you for joining me today, for teaching me, for joining this conversation that I found really kind of encouraging, and I hope that you found it useful, and that, it can be a model for the type of conversations that we're all able to run in our classrooms, going forward.
Thank you very much.
It's actually been really interesting having these sorts of conversations while we're also separate. And I wonder if it's a way, a way for people to meet in the future when people are back in their locations, because it does allow you to connect in a way that I certainly didn't connect when I was actually doing the volunteer work in Athens.
Yeah, it's nice to have like a kind of forum to chat, and yeah, maybe we can think about how that could work in the future. Yeah, I think it's nice.
Okay. Thank you very much. But Olivia, would you mind connecting me with Sami Janssens maybe after this meeting?
Yeah, I'll ask him for sure. Oh, he's there. I thought you'd gone, Sam.
Okay.
Yeah, sure. I can
Okay.
tell you.
Thank you very much.
Sure. Pleasure.
Okay. Okay.
Thank you so much.